Okay guys, this is your shaft mount reducer lab. Okay, I have three different types of shaft mount reducers here. This one takes a single tapered bushing to mount it on the shaft of the machine. Okay, this one all the way on the other side takes two bushings. This is called a twin tapered bush reducer. And the one in the middle, it's one bushing, but it's a special bushing. It has a special collar on it there to do the tightening. All right, so we'll see how to mount all three of these. Now, we've got to use our imagination here a little bit. This is the shaft, so this is going to represent some big old machine about right there, and that's the shaft sticking out of that machine. We're actually going to mount each one of these reducers on that shaft. However, we've found for training purposes, it's a whole lot easier to just have a little dummy shaft here, leave the reducer on the table, slide the shaft in the reducer, as opposed to picking the reducer up and hanging it on the shaft. It's a whole lot easier on the instructor, so naturally that's the way we do it. Okay, so let's start with the single tapered bushing. This happens to be a Morris or a Browning. It's the same thing. That's the brand. So here's a bushing that we're going to use to mount that. Now, as you see, I've been referring to this as the shaft. So that's the output shaft of the reducer. It's actually hollow, and that's going to slide up onto the shaft of the machine. But obviously, as you can see, the shaft is a lot smaller than the bore of the reducer. Therefore, we're going to use a bushing. All right. And the reason for that is this one reducer can fit many different shaft sizes. It all depends on what bore you use in the bushing that you have. See, all the bushings that fit this size box will have the same tapered OD, but they will have different IDs depending on what shaft size you have on your machine. Okay, so in order to mount this, okay, again, remember the machine is right here. The machine weighs, probably 100 tons or something. We're certainly not going to move it. So it would be easier to pick up the reducer and mount it on the shaft. But here in the classroom, it's easier to do it the other way around. Okay, the first thing we would do, we would put the bushing on the shaft, okay? And we would line up the keyway here so that we could put the proper key in there. I'm not going to do that either in this lab, but we would put the key in the keyway, and then we would pick up the reducer and put it on the shaft, or for our purposes here, we're going to slide the shaft and the bushing into the reducer. Okay. Now, when we get it in there, we have three bolts. We're going to line up. There's a little collar on the reducer that rotates. So we're going to line up these three holes. I'm going through the three holes in the flange of the bushing that do not have any threads, and I'm screwing those into that rotating collar, that can be rotated so it can line up on the reducer itself. So do that. Kind of snug them down there a little bit. Okay, and then I would look up the torque specs, and I would torque these down evenly, starting with one and going to the next, going to the next, and I would keep tightening these until that bushing gets squeezed down really tight on the shaft. And then that is going to hold the reducer on the shaft. Okay, there you go. Now, you would obviously tighten it a lot more than I've done there, but you would tighten it down to the proper specs. Now, let me spin it around here a little bit. See, the input shaft is over here, see. That's the input shaft, and this is the output shaft on the machine. So an electric motor would be turning the input shaft, and as you see, then the output shaft of the machine is turning there. So that's the way it works. Generally, it's an electric motor sitting on the special bracket on top of the shaft mount reducer, and a V-belt drive running down to the input shaft. So there we have that reducer mounted onto the shaft of the machine. Now you may say, well, how do you take it off? Well, I'm glad you asked. What we do to take it off is we have to take the 3 bolts back out. And just taking the bolts out will not allow that reducer to slide off of there, because we have a clamping action when we tighten down on a tapered bushing, right? So it's not going to slide off of that shaft. But there are 2 holes in this flange of the bushing that have threads. So I'm going to put my 2 screws, 2 of the 3 screws, in those 2 holes. And I'm just going to tighten them down finger tight. And what they'll do when they go through the flange, they will bump into the reducer. Okay. Then when I start tightening, these bolts are pushing that reducer off of the bushing. This was really easy to do because I didn't make it really tight, but I just pushed enough that that reducer goes right off the bushing. So then you can grab the reducer and remove it, or in my case, I'm just removing the shaft. See? All right. So that's a single tapered bushed shaft mount reducer. All right. Now let's go all the way over to the other side here. The twin tapered bush. This is a Dodge twin bushing, twin tapered bushings, they say. Okay, one on either side of the output shaft. And I'm going to do the same thing. The input shaft is here, right? This is the output shaft. This is the input shaft. Oh, I got to get my machine. Let me drag this 100-ton machine over here. Okay, got the machine in place, right? So now I'm going to put this reducer on the machine. Well, obviously, shaft's not big enough, right? Well, see, this reducer is also made so that it'll fit many different types of shafts. It all depends on the bushings that you get. See, now all of the bushings for this size box will have the same OD on the taper, but you can get different IDs of the bushing. You would actually get a bushing, 2 bushings with IDs that would fit the shaft. See, okay. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and mount. I'm going to go ahead and kind of pre-assemble here a little bit. I'm going to mount this bushing there. I'm going to leave it extremely loose. Then I'm going to go back to the other side over here, and I'm going to do the same thing. Again, I'm just starting the bolts. I don't want them to have any tightness at all. Okay, so then I would make sure I had my key in the keyway, and then I would line that up, and I would slide the reducer up on the shaft of the machine until it sticks out the other side a little ways, just so it sticks out. It doesn't have to stick out a lot, just so it goes all. You have been assured that it goes all the way through. Okay, so then you want to not lose your wrenches, because you need to tighten these things up. So we, just like before, we start tightening these screws. I can finger tighten these a little bit more. So I'm going to tighten this one up more, tighten this one up, tighten this one, that one. Just keep going around the pattern there, tightening up these screws. And what that's doing is squeezing the reducer up on the taper of the bushing, which causes the bushing to be squeezed down around the shaft. So it's like a press fit. You don't get a better fit than a tapered bush. I mean, that's like pressing it on there, but it's a whole lot easier to do. Then I've got the back one tight. Of course, I didn't tighten it as much as it needs to be. You would look up the torque specs. You would tighten it down to what the catalog says. Okay. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the other bushing on this Dodge shaft mount reducer. So I'm going to go around the pattern, tightening up those bolts. That's how it works. Again, I didn't tighten it all the way down. You would tighten it to the torque specs. Then you say, well, how do we take it off? Okay, just the reverse. Here we go. Got to take these 3 bolts back out. 3 bolts out. And you'll see there are 2 holes that have threads in them where I can put 2 of the bolts back in to the flange. Finger tighten it until it bumps into this ring again on the reducer. Get my second bolt in there. Finger tighten that puppy. And then, as I tighten up these bolts, that is going to cause that bushing to be basically pulled out of the reducer. Okay, so it pulls it right out of there. Now I'll do the same thing to the back. Taking my 3 bolts out, putting 2 of them back in, the threaded holes in the flange. Until they bump into the ring that's part of the reducer. Finger tighten them. Then you get your wrench on there and start tightening them more. And at some point in time, you're going to just pop the reducer and the bushing apart. Okay. There we go, got it apart. Now, you can pull those screws back out. And I can take that. I can actually pull the whole box off of the shaft of the machine, right? So there's the bushing that was in the back. Here's the bushing that was up near the machine. So there's the shaft of the machine. That's how you take that reducer off the machine. Okay, now this is a Falk quad drive, and it's got a special type of mechanism for tightening down the bushing. It's a collar here with some notches, and on the collar here you would use a spanner wrench to tighten this thing down. So let me move around to the business end of this reducer. So once again, here's the big old machine here. We need to get that reducer on this shaft of the machine. So what I would do to start with is I would get the bushing on the shaft of the machine. I would make sure I had my keyway in there, and then I would pick up that reducer and slide it up here. But since I don't want to pick up the reducer, I'm going to move the shaft. Put it right in there. And then I can start tightening the collar here. And as I tighten that collar, see, that's actually doing the same thing as tightening these 3 bolts in these other type reducers, or these other type bushings, tapered bushings that go in the reducer. So by tightening this, I'm squeezing that bushing down on the shaft. Now I don't have a spanner wrench with me right here, but a spanner wrench would fit into those grooves there and, you know, have a long handle on it, and you could really get some good torque on that and tighten that thing down. Okay. All right. Then a unique thing about this particular box is to disassemble it. You could obviously take a spanner wrench and crank it the other way and take it off. Obviously, that's what you would do. Or they make a special tool to remove the bushings using the force multiplication, the torque multiplication through the reducer. Now this particular tool is too large to use on this small box, but it would be bolted to the box, and then this right here, part of the tool, would fit down in the notch, and then as you would turn the input shaft the other way, as you turn the input shaft, that is actually unscrewing this collar on the shaft, and then you can pull the box off the off the machine. So this collar here, it's a single bush reducer, but the special collar there allows you to assemble it easily. It also allows you to disassemble it by actually using the torque modification of the gearbox. By turning the input shaft, you're going to be disassembling it by unscrewing the big collar here. So the fault box can be taken right off the shaft like that. Okay, so that's what you do in the shaft mount reducer lab. Okay, you will mount and dismount a single bushed reducer. You'll mount and dismount a twin tapered bush reducer, and then you'll mount and dismount the Falk quad drive with this special type of reducer bushing here. Okay. All right, so that's it for the shaft mount reducer, guys. Thanks.